1. The Red Room. We could not go for a walk that afternoon. There was such a freezing cold wind and such heavy rain that we all stayed indoors. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially in winter. I used to hate coming home when it was almost dark, with ice-cold fingers and toes, feeling miserable because Bessie, the nursemaid, was always scolding me. All the time, I knew I was different from my cousins, Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. They were taller and stronger than me, and they were loved. These three usually spent their time crying and quarrelling, but today they were sitting quietly around their mother in the sitting room. I wanted to join the family circle, but Mrs. Reed, my aunt, refused. Bessie had complained about me. "No, I'm sorry, Jane. Until I hear from Bessie or see for myself that you are really trying to behave better, you cannot be treated as a good, happy child, like my children." "What does Bessie say I have done?" I asked. "Jane, it is not polite to question me in that way. If you cannot speak pleasantly, be quiet." I crept out of the sitting room and into the small room next door, where I chose a book full of pictures from the bookcase. I climbed onto the window seat and drew the curtains so that I was completely hidden. I sat there for a while. Sometimes I looked out of the window at the grey November afternoon and saw the rain pouring down on the leafless garden. But most of the time I studied the book and stared fascinated at the pictures. Lost in the world of imagination, I forgot my sad, lonely existence for a while and was happy. I was only afraid that my secret hiding place might be discovered. Suddenly, the door of the room opened. John Reed rushed in. "Where are you, rat?" he shouted. He did not see me behind the curtain. "Eliza, Georgie, Jane isn't here. Tell Mama she's run out into the rain. What a bad animal she is." How lucky I drew the curtain, I thought. He would never have found me because he was not very intelligent. But Eliza guessed at once where I was. "She's in the window seat, John," she called from the sitting room. So I came out immediately, as I did not want him to pull me out. "What do you want?" I asked him. "Say, what do you want, Master Reed?" he answered, sitting in an armchair. "I want you to come here." John Reed was 14, and I was only 10. He was large and rather fat. He usually ate too much at meals, which made him ill. He should have been at boarding school, but his mother, who loved him very much, had brought him home for a month or two because she thought his health was delicate. John did not love his mother or his sisters, and he hated me. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times a week, not once or twice a day, but all the time. My whole body trembled when he came near. Sometimes he hit me, sometimes he just threatened me, and I lived in terrible fear of him. I had no idea how to stop him. The servants did not want to offend their young master, and Mrs. Reed could see no fault in her dear boy. So I obeyed John's order and approached his armchair, thinking how very ugly his face was. Perhaps he understood what I was thinking, for he hit me hard on the face. "That is for your rudeness to Mama just now," he said, "and for your wickedness in hiding, and for looking at me like that, you rat." I was so used to his bullying that I never thought of hitting him back. "What were you doing behind that curtain?" he asked. "I was reading," I answered. "Show me the book." I gave it to him. "You have no right to take our books," he continued. "You have no money, and your father left you none. You ought to beg in the streets, not live here in comfort with a gentleman's family. Anyway, all these books are mine, and so is the whole house, or will be in a few years' time. I'll teach you not to borrow my books again." He lifted the heavy book and threw it hard at me. It hit me and I fell, cutting my head on the door. I was in great pain, and suddenly, for the first time in my life, I forgot my fear of John Reed. "You wicked, cruel boy," I cried. "You are a bully. You are as bad as a murderer." "What? What?" he cried. "Did she say that to me? Did you hear Eliza and Georgiana? I'll tell Mamma, but first—" He rushed to attack me, but now he was fighting with a desperate girl. I really saw him as a wicked murderer. I felt the blood running down my face, and the pain gave me strength. I fought back as hard as I could. My resistance surprised him, and he shouted for help. His sisters ran for Mrs. Reed, who called her maid Miss Abbott, and Bessie. They pulled us apart, and I heard them say, "What a wicked girl! She attacked Master John." Mrs. Reed said calmly, "Take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there." And so I was carried upstairs, arms waving and legs kicking. As soon as we arrived in the Red Room, I became quiet again, and the two servants both started scolding me. "Really, Miss Eyre," said Miss Abbott, "how could you hit him? He's your young master." "How can he be my master? I'm not a servant," I cried. "No, Miss Eyre. You are less than a servant because you do not work," replied Miss Abbott. They both looked at me as if they strongly disapproved of me. "You should remember, miss," said Bessie, "that your aunt pays for your food and clothes, and you should be grateful. You have no other relations or friends." All my short life I had been told this, and I had no answer to it. I stayed silent, listening to these painful reminders. "And if you are angry and rude, Mrs. Reed may send you away," added Bessie. "Anyway," said Miss Abbott, "God will punish you, Jane Eyre, for your wicked heart. Pray to God and say you're sorry." They left the room, locking the door carefully behind them. The Red Room was a cold, silent room, hardly ever used, although it was one of the largest bedrooms in the house. 9 years ago, my uncle, Mr. Reed, had died in this room, and since then nobody had wanted to sleep in it. Now that I was alone, I thought bitterly of the people I lived with. John Reed, his sisters, his mother, the servants, they all accused me, scolded me, hated me. Why could I never please them? Eliza was selfish but was respected. Georgiana had a bad temper, but she was popular with everybody because she was beautiful. John was rude, cruel, and violent, but nobody punished him. I tried to make no mistakes, but they called me naughty every moment of the day. Now that I'd turned against John to protect myself, everybody blamed me. And so I spent that whole long afternoon in the Red Room, asking myself why I had to suffer and why life was so unfair. Perhaps I would run away or starve myself to death. Gradually it became dark outside. The rain was still beating on the windows, and I could hear the wind in the trees. Now I was no longer angry, and I began to think the Reeds might be right. Perhaps I was wicked. Did I deserve to die and be buried in the churchyard like my Uncle Reed? I could not remember him, but knew he was my mother's brother, who had taken me to his house when my parents both died. On his deathbed, he had made his wife, Aunt Reed, promise to look after me like her own children. I supposed she now regretted her promise. A strange idea came to me. I felt sure that if Mr. Reed had lived, he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I looked round at the dark furniture and the walls in shadow, I began to fear that his ghost might come back to punish his wife for not keeping her promise. He might rise from the grave in the churchyard and appear in this room. I was so frightened by this thought that I hardly dared to breathe. Suddenly, in the darkness, I saw a light moving on the ceiling. It may have been from a lamp outside, but in my nervous state I did not think of that. I felt sure it must be a ghost, a visitor from another world. My head was hot. My heart beat fast. Was that the sound of wings in my ears? Was that something moving near me? Screaming wildly, I rushed to the door and shook it. Miss Abbott and Bessie came running to open it. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" asked Bessie. "Take me out of here!" I screamed. "Why, what's the matter?" she asked. "I saw a light, and I thought it was a ghost," I cried, holding tightly onto Bessie's hand. "She's not even hurt," said Miss Abbott in disgust. "She screamed just to bring us here. I know all her little tricks." "What is all this?" demanded an angry voice. Mrs. Reed appeared at the door of the room. "Abbott and Bessie, I think I told you to leave Jane Eyre in this room till I came." "She screamed so loudly, Mum," said Bessie softly. "Let go of her hands, Bessie," was Mrs. Reed's only answer. "Jane Eyre, you need not think you can succeed in getting out of the room like this. Your naughty tricks will not work with me. You will stay here an hour longer as a punishment for trying to deceive us." "Oh, Aunt, please forgive me. I can't bear it. I shall die if you keep me here." I screamed and kicked as she held me. "Silence! Control yourself!" She pushed me, resisting wildly, back into the Red Room and locked me in. There I was in the darkness again, with the silence and the ghosts. I must have fainted. I cannot remember anything more. Chapter 2. Leaving Gateshead. I woke up to find the doctor lifting me very carefully into my own bed. It was good to be back in my familiar bedroom, with a warm fire and candlelight. It was also a great relief to recognise Dr. Lloyd, who Mrs. Reed called in for her servants. She always called a specialist for herself and the children. He was looking after me so kindly. I felt he would protect me from Mrs. Reed. He talked to me a little, then gave Bessie orders to take good care of me. When he left, I felt very lonely again. But I was surprised to find that Bessie did not scold me at all. In fact, she was so kind to me that I became brave enough to ask a question. "Bessie, what's happened? Am I ill?" "Yes, you became ill in the Red Room, but you'll get better. Don't worry, Miss Jane," she answered. Then she went next door to fetch another servant. I could hear her whispers. "Sarah, come in here and sleep with me and that poor child tonight. I daren't stay alone with her. She might die. She was so ill last night. Do you think she saw a ghost? Mrs. Reed was too hard on her, I think." So the two servants slept in my room, while I lay awake all night, trembling with fear and eyes wide open in horror, imagining ghosts in every corner. Fortunately, I suffered no serious illness as a result of my terrible experience in the Red Room, although I shall never forget that night. But the shock left me nervous and depressed for the next few days. I cried all day long, and although Bessie tried hard to tempt me with nice things to eat or my favourite books, I took no pleasure in eating or even in reading. I knew I had no one to love me and nothing to look forward to. When the doctor came again, he seemed a little surprised to find me looking so miserable. "Perhaps she's crying because she couldn't go out with Mrs. Reed in the carriage this morning," suggested Bessie. "Surely she's more sensible than that," said the doctor, smiling at me. "She's a big girl now." "I'm not crying about that. I hate going out in the carriage," I said quickly. "I'm crying because I'm miserable." "Oh, really, miss," said Bessie. The doctor looked at me thoughtfully. He had small, grey, intelligent eyes. Just then a bell rang for the servants' dinner. "You can go, Bessie," he said. "I'll stay here talking to Miss Jane till you come back." After Bessie had left, he asked, "What really made you ill?" "I was locked up in a room with a ghost, in the dark." "Afraid of ghosts, are you?" He smiled. "Of Mr. Reed's ghost, yes. He died in that room, you know. Nobody even goes in there anymore. It was cruel to lock me in there alone without a candle. I shall never forget it." "But you aren't afraid now. There must be another reason why you're so sad," he said, looking kindly at me. How could I tell him all the reasons for my unhappiness? "I have no father or mother, brothers or sisters," I began. "But you have a kind aunt and cousins." "But John Reed knocked me down, and my aunt locked me in the Red Room," I cried. There was a pause. "Don't you like living at Gateshead in such a beautiful house?" he asked. "I would be glad to leave it, but I have nowhere else to go." "You have no relations apart from Mrs. Reed?" "I think I may have some who are very poor, but I know nothing about them," I answered. "Would you like to go to school?" he asked finally. I thought for a moment. I knew very little about school, but at least it would be a change, the start of a new life. "Yes, I would like to go," I replied in the end. "Well, well," said the doctor to himself as he got up. "We'll see. The child is delicate. She ought to have a change of air." I heard later from the servants that he had spoken to Mrs. Reed about me, and that she had agreed immediately to send me to school. Abbott said Mrs. Reed would be glad to get rid of me. In this conversation, I also learned for the first time that my father had been a poor vicar. When he married my mother, Miss Jane Reed of Gateshead, the Reed family was so angry that they disinherited her. I also heard that my parents both died of an illness only a year after their wedding. But days and weeks passed, and Mrs. Reed still said nothing about sending me to school. One day, as she was scolding me, I suddenly threw a question at her. The words just came out without my planning to say them. "What would Uncle Reed say to you if he were alive?" I asked. "What?" cried Mrs. Reed, her cold grey eyes full of fear, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I had to continue. "My Uncle Reed is now in heaven and can see all you think and do, and so can my parents. They know how you hate me and are cruel to me." Mrs. Reed smacked my face and left me without a word. I was scolded for an hour by Bessie as the most ungrateful child in the world, and indeed, with so much hate in my heart, I did feel wicked. Christmas passed by, with no presents or new clothes for me. Every evening I watched Eliza and Georgiana putting on their new dresses and going out to parties. Sometimes Bessie would come up to me in my lonely bedroom, bringing a piece of cake. Sometimes she would tell me a story, and sometimes she would kiss me good night. When she was kind to me, I thought she was the best person in the world, but she did not always have time for me. On the morning of the 15th of January, Bessie rushed up to my room to tell me a visitor wanted to see me. Who could it be? I knew Mrs. Reed would be there too, and I was frightened of seeing her again. When I nervously entered the breakfast room, I looked up at a black column. At least that is what he looked like to me. He was a tall, thin man dressed all in black, with a cold, stony face at the top of the column. "This is the little girl I wrote you about," said Mrs. Reed to the stony stranger. "Well, Jane Eyre," said the stranger heavily, "and are you a good child?" It was impossible to say yes, with Mrs. Reed sitting there, so I was silent. "Perhaps the less said about that, the better, Mr. Brocklehurst," said Mrs. Reed, shaking her head. "I'm sorry to hear it," he answered. "Come here, Jane Eyre, and answer my questions. Where do the wicked go after death?" "They go to hell," I answered. "And what must you do to avoid going there?" he asked. I thought for a moment, but could not find the right answer. "I must keep in good health and not die," I replied. "Wrong. Children younger than you die all the time. Another question. Do you enjoy reading the Bible?" "Yes, sometimes," I replied, hesitating. "That is not enough. Your answers show me you have a wicked heart. You must pray to God to change it if you ever want to go to heaven." "Mr. Brocklehurst," interrupted Mrs. Reed, "I mentioned to you in my letter that this little girl has in fact a very bad character. If you accept her at Lowood School, please make sure that the headmistress and teachers know how dishonest she is. She will try to lie to them, of course. You see, Jane, you cannot try your tricks on Mr. Brocklehurst." However hard I had tried to please Mrs. Reed in the past, she always thought the worst of me. It was not surprising that I had come to hate her. Now she was accusing me in front of a stranger. My hopes of starting a new life at school began to fade. "Do not worry, madam," Mr. Brocklehurst said. "The teachers will watch her carefully. Life at Lowood will do her good. We believe in hard work, plain food, simple clothes, and no luxury of any kind." "I will send her as soon as possible then, Mr. Brocklehurst. I hope she will be taught according to her low position in life." "Indeed she will, madam. I hope she will be grateful for this opportunity to improve her character. Little girl, read this book. It tells the story of the sudden death of a young girl who was a liar. Read and pray." After Mr. Brocklehurst had given me the book and left, I felt I had to speak. Anger was boiling up inside me. I walked up to Mrs. Reed and looked straight into her eyes. "I do not deceive people. If I told lies, I would say I loved you, but I don't. I hate you. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. If anyone asks how you treated me, I will tell them the truth, that you are very cruel to me. People think you're a good woman, but you are lying to them." Even before I'd finished, I began to experience a great feeling of freedom and relief. At last, I had said what I felt. Mrs. Reed looked frightened and unhappy. "Jane, I want to be your friend. You don't know what you're saying. You are too excited. Go to your room and lie down." "I won't lie down. I'm quite calm. Send me to school soon, Mrs. Reed. I hate living here." "I will indeed send her soon," murmured Mrs. Reed to herself. Part 2. A Girl at Lowood. Chapter 3. My First Impressions of School. Mrs. Reed arranged for me to leave on the 19th of January. I had to get up very early to catch the coach, but Bessie helped me to get ready. "Will you say goodbye to Mrs. Reed, Jane?" she asked. "No, she said I shouldn't disturb her so early. Anyway, I don't want to say anything to her. She's always hated me." "Oh, Miss Jane, don't say that." "Goodbye to Gateshead!" I shouted wildly as we walked together out of the front door to wait for the coach in the road. It arrived, pulled by 4 horses and full of passengers. The coachman took my luggage and called me to hurry up. Bessie kissed me for the last time as I held tightly to her. She shouted up to the coachman, "Make sure you take care of her. 50 miles is a long way for a young child to go alone." "I will," he answered. The door was closed and the coach rolled off. What a strange feeling to be leaving Gateshead, my home for the whole of my childhood. Although I was sad to say goodbye to Bessie, I was both excited and nervous about the new places I would see and the new people I would meet. I do not remember much about the journey, except that it seemed far too long. We stopped for lunch to change the horses. Then in the afternoon, I realized we were driving through countryside. I slept for a short time, but was woken when the coach stopped. The door opened and a servant called in. "Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here?" "Yes," I answered, and was helped out of the coach with my luggage. Tired and confused after the journey, I followed the servant into a large building, where she left me in a sitting room. In came a tall lady with dark hair and eyes, and a large, pale forehead. I discovered that she was Miss Temple, the headmistress of Lowood School. She looked at me carefully. "You're very young to be sent alone. You look tired, are you?" she asked, putting her hand kindly on my shoulder. "A little, ma'am," I replied. "How old are you, and what is your name?" "I'm Jane Eyre, ma'am, and I'm 10 years old." "Well, I hope you will be a good child at school," she said, touching my cheek gently with her finger. I was taken by a teacher, Miss Miller, through the silent corridors of the large school to the long, wide schoolroom. There, about 80 girls, aged from 9 to 20, sat doing their homework. I sat on a bench near the door with my slate. "Put away the lesson books and fetch the supper trays," called Miss Miller. 4 tall girls removed all the books, then went out and returned with trays which were handed round. Each child could have a drink of water out of the shared cup and could take a small piece of biscuit. Then we all went quietly upstairs to the long, crowded bedroom, where 2 children shared every bed. I had to share Miss Miller's, but I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. In the morning, the ringing of a bell woke me, although it was still dark. I got dressed quickly in the bitter cold of the room and washed when I could. There was only 1 basin for 6 girls. When the bell rang again, we all went downstairs, 2 by 2, and silently entered the cold, badly lit schoolroom for prayers. As the bell rang a 3rd time to indicate the beginning of lessons, the girls moved into 4 groups around 4 tables, and the teachers came into the room to start the Bible class. I was put in the bottom class. How glad I was when it was time for breakfast. I'd hardly eaten anything the day before. But the only food served to us was porridge, which was burnt. It was so disgusting that we could not eat it, so we left the dining room with empty stomachs. After breakfast came the one happy moment of the day, when the pupils could play and talk freely. We all complained bitterly about the uneatable breakfast. Lessons started again at 9 o'clock and finished at 12, when Miss Temple stood up to speak to the whole school. "Girls, this morning you had a breakfast which you couldn't eat. You must be hungry, so I have ordered a lunch of bread and cheese for you all." The teachers looked at her in surprise. "Don't worry, I take responsibility for it," she told them. We were delighted, and all rushed out into the garden to eat our lunch. Nobody had taken any notice of me so far, but I did not mind that. I stood alone outside, watching some of the stronger girls playing, trying to forget the bitter cold, and thinking about my life. Gateshead and the Reed family seemed a long way away. I was not yet used to school life, and what sort of future could I look forward to? As I wondered, I saw a girl near me reading a book. I felt brave enough to speak to her, since I too liked reading. "Is your book interesting? What is it about?" I asked. "Well, I like it," she said after a pause, looking at me. "Here, have a look at it." I glanced quickly at it, but found it too difficult to understand, so I gave it back. "What sort of school is this?" I asked. "It's called Lowood School. It's a charity school. We're all charity children, you see. I expect your parents are dead, aren't they? All the girls here have lost either one or both parents." "Don't we pay anything? Is the school free?" I asked. "We pay, or our relations pay, £15 a year for each of us. That isn't enough, so some kind ladies and gentlemen in London pay the rest. That's why it's called a charity school." "Who is Mr. Brocklehurst?" was my next question. "His mother built this part of the school. He's the manager and looks after all financial matters. He lives in a large house near here." I did not see her again until during the afternoon lessons, when I noticed that she'd been sent to stand alone in the middle of the schoolroom. I could not imagine what she had done to deserve such a punishment, but she did not look ashamed or unhappy. She was lost in thought, and did not seem to notice that everyone was looking at her. If that happened to me, I thought, I would be so embarrassed. After lessons, we had a small cup of coffee and half a piece of brown bread, then half an hour's play, then homework. Finally, after the evening biscuit and drink of water, we said prayers and went to bed. That was my first day at Lowood. Chapter 4. Making a Friend. The next morning we got up in the dark as before, but the water was frozen, so we could not wash. It was freezing cold in all the rooms. This time the porridge was not burnt, but I still felt hungry, as the quantity was so small. I stayed in the bottom class, but noticed the girl that I'd been talking to was in another class. Her surname seemed to be Burns. Teachers called girls by their surnames in this school. Her class was studying history, and her teacher, Miss Scatcherd, appeared constantly annoyed by her. "Burns, hold your head up, can't you? Burns, don't stand like that." The history questions asked by Miss Scatcherd sounded very difficult, but Burns knew all the answers. I kept expecting the teacher to praise her, but instead, she suddenly cried out, "You dirty girl! You haven't washed your hands this morning!" I was surprised that Burns did not explain that none of us could wash our faces or hands because the water had been frozen. Miss Scatcherd gave an order. Burns left the room and returned carrying a stick. The teacher took it and hit Burns several times with it. The girl did not cry or change her expression. "Wicked girl!" said Miss Scatcherd. "Nothing will change your dirty habits." Later that day, during the play hour, I found Burns alone by the fireside, reading the same book as before, and I started talking to her. "What is the rest of your name?" I asked. "Helen," she replied. "Do you want to leave Lowood?" "No, why should I? I was sent to school here, so I must learn as much as I can." "But Miss Scatcherd is so cruel to you," I burst out. "Cruel? Not at all. She is strict and she sees my faults. If I were you, I'd hate her, I cried. If she hit me with a stick, I'd seize it and break it under her nose. I don't think you would, answered Helen quietly. And if you did, Mr. Brocklehurst would send you away from school and your relations would be upset. Anyway, the Bible tells us to do good, even if other people hurt us. Sometimes you have to put up with some hard things in life. I could not understand her ideas, but I had a feeling she might be right. I looked at her in wonder. You say you have faults, Helen. What are they? To me, you seem very good. You're wrong, she answered. I'm untidy and careless, and I forget the rules. I read when I should be doing my homework. You see, Miss Scatcherd is right to scold me. Is Miss Temple as strict as that? I asked. A soft smile passed over Helen's normally serious face. Miss Temple is full of goodness. She gently tells me of my mistakes and praises me if I do well. But even with her help, I don't concentrate properly in class. I just dream away the time, and then I can't answer the teacher's questions. But today in history you knew all the answers, I said. I just happened to be interested, that's all, she replied. I expect you're always interested in Miss Temple's lessons, because you like her and she's good to you. I'm like that. I love those who love me, and I hate those who punish me unfairly. You should read the Bible and do what Christ says. People who believe in God should love their enemies, said Helen. Then I should love Mrs. Reed and her son John, which is impossible, I cried. Helen asked me to explain what I meant, and listened carefully to the long story of what I had suffered at Gateshead. Well, I asked impatiently at the end, isn't Mrs. Reed a bad woman? Don't you agree with me? It's true she has been unkind to you because she dislikes your faults, as Miss Scatcherd dislikes mine. But look how bitterly you remember every angry word. Wouldn't you be happier if you tried to forget her scolding? Life is too short to continue hating anyone for a long time. We all have faults, but the time will come soon when we die, when our wickedness will pass away with our bodies, leaving only the pure flame of the spirit. That's why I never think of revenge. I never consider life unfair. I live in calm, looking forward to the end. For a moment, we both stayed silent. Then one of the big girls came up, calling, Helen Burns, go and put away your work and tidy your drawer immediately, or I'll tell Miss Scatcherd. Helen sighed, and getting up, silently obeyed. Chapter 5. Mr. Brocklehurst's Visit and its Results. It was difficult for me to get used to the school rules at Lowood, and to the hard physical conditions. In January, February and March, there was deep snow, but we still had to spend an hour outside every day. We had no boots or gloves, and my hands and feet ached badly. We were growing children and needed more food than was provided. Sometimes the big girls bullied us little ones and made us hand over our tea-time bread or evening biscuit. One afternoon, when I had been at Lowood for 3 weeks, a visitor arrived. All the teachers and pupils stood respectfully as he entered the schoolroom. I looked up. There, next to Miss Temple, stood the same black column which had frowned on me in the breakfast room at Gateshead. I had been afraid he would come. I remembered only too well Mrs. Reed's description of my character, and the promise he had given her to warn teachers at Lowood about my wickedness. Now they would consider me a bad child forever. At first, Mr. Brocklehurst spoke in a murmur to Miss Temple. I could just hear, because I was at the front of the class. Tell the housekeeper she must count the needles and only give out one at a time to the girls. They lose them so easily. And Miss Temple, please make sure the girls' stockings are mended more carefully. Some of them have a lot of holes." "I shall follow your instructions, sir," said Miss Temple. "And another thing which surprises me. I find that a lunch of bread and cheese has been served to the girls recently. Why is this? There is nothing about it in the rules. Who is responsible?" "I myself, sir," answered Miss Temple. "The breakfast was so badly cooked that the girls couldn't possibly eat it, so they were hungry." "Madam, listen to me for a moment. You know that I am trying to bring up these girls to be strong, patient, and unselfish. If some little luxury is not available, do not replace it with something else, but tell them to be brave and suffer, like Christ himself. Remember what the Bible says. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. Madam, when you put bread into these children's mouths, you feed their bodies, but you starve their souls." Miss Temple did not reply. She looked straight in front of her, and her face was as cold and hard as marble. Mr. Brocklehurst, on the other hand, now looked round at the girls, and almost jumped in surprise. "Who? What is that girl with red hair? With curls, madam? With curls everywhere?" "That is Julia Severn," said Miss Temple quietly. "Her hair curls naturally, you see." "Naturally, yes. But it is God we obey, not nature. Miss Temple, that girl's hair must be cut off. I have said again and again that hair must be arranged modestly and plainly. I see other girls here with too much hair. Yes, I shall send someone tomorrow to cut all the girls' hair." "Mr. Brocklehurst," began Miss Temple. "No, Miss Temple, I insist. To please God, these girls must have short, straight hair and plain, simple clothes." He was interrupted by the arrival of 3 ladies, who had unfortunately not heard his comments on dress and hair. They all wore the most expensive clothes and had beautiful, long, curly hair. I heard Miss Temple greet them as the wife and daughters of Mr. Brocklehurst. I had hoped to hide my face behind my slate while Mr. Brocklehurst was talking, so that he would not recognize me, but suddenly the slate fell from my hand and broke in 2 on the hard floor. I knew only too well what would happen next. "A careless girl," said Mr. Brocklehurst quietly, almost to himself. "The new girl, I see. I must not forget to say something to the whole school about her." And then to me aloud, "Come here, child." I was too frightened to move, but 2 big girls pushed me towards him. Miss Temple whispered kindly in my ear, "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident." Her kindness touched me, but I knew that soon she would hear the lies about me, and then she would hate me. "Put the child on that chair," said Mr. Brocklehurst. Someone lifted me up onto a high chair so that I was close to his nose. Frightened and shaking, I felt everyone's eyes on me. "You see this girl?" began the black marble column. "She is young. She looks like an ordinary child. Nothing about her tells you she is evil. But she is all wickedness. Children, don't talk to her. Stay away from her. Teachers, watch her. Punish her body to save her soul, if indeed she has a soul, because this child, I can hardly say it, this child is a liar." "How shocking!" said the 2 Brocklehurst daughters, each wiping a tear or 2 from their eyes. "I learned this fact," continued the great man, "from Mrs. Reed, the kind lady who took care of her after her parents' death and brought her up as a member of the family. In the end, Mrs. Reed was so afraid of this child's evil influence on her own children that she had to send her here. Teachers, watch her carefully." The Brocklehurst family stood up and moved slowly out of the schoolroom. At the door, my judge turned and said, "She must stand half an hour longer on that chair, and nobody may speak to her for the rest of the day." So there I was, high up on the chair, publicly displayed as an ugly example of evil. Feelings of shame and anger boiled up inside me, but just as I felt I could not bear it any longer, Helen Burns walked past me and lifted her eyes to mine. Her look calmed me. What a smile she had! It was an intelligent, brave smile, lighting up her thin face and her tired grey eyes. When all the girls left the schoolroom at 5 o'clock, I climbed down from the chair and sat on the floor. I no longer felt strong or calm, and I began to cry bitterly. I had wanted so much to make friends at Lowood, to be good, to deserve praise. Now nobody would believe me, or perhaps even speak to me. Could I ever start a new life after this? "Never," I cried. "I wish I were dead." Just then, Helen arrived, bringing my coffee and bread. I was too upset to eat or drink, but she sat with me for some time, talking gently to me, wiping away my tears and helping me to recover. When Miss Temple came to look for me, she found us sitting quietly together. "Come up to my room, both of you," she said. We went to her warm, comfortable room upstairs. "Now tell me the truth, Jane," she said. "You have been accused, and you must have the chance to defend yourself." And so I told her the whole story of my lonely childhood with the Reed family, and of my terrible experience in the Red Room. "I know Dr. Lloyd, who saw you when you were ill," she said. "I'll write to him and see if he agrees with what you say. If he does, I shall publicly tell the school you are not a liar. I believe you now, Jane." And she kissed me. She turned to Helen. "How are you tonight, Helen? Have you coughed a lot today?" "Not very much, Ma'am." "And the pain in your chest?" "It's a little better, I think." Miss Temple examined Helen carefully and sighed a little. Then she gave us some tea and toast. For a while I felt I was in heaven, eating and drinking in the warm, pretty room with kind Miss Temple and Helen. But when we reached our bedroom, Miss Scatcherd was checking the drawers. "Burns," she said, "yours is far too untidy. Tomorrow all day you will wear a notice on your forehead saying untidy." Helen said Miss Scatcherd was quite right, and wore the notice all the next day. But I was furious, and at the end of the afternoon tore it off her head and threw it in the fire. When Miss Temple received a letter from Dr. Lloyd agreeing that what I had said was true, she told the whole school that I had been wrongly accused and was not a liar. From that moment, I felt I was accepted, and set to work to learn as much as I could and make as many friends as possible.